All right, guys, how's it going? I was not able to finish this chapter. So I'm going to shoot you a video today, and we will finish it up. I've got my little questions here. So I thought we'd just run through this. I'm going to try to get where we, I'm going to make sure I answer the short answer questions. But I'm going to see if I can get us to where I tried to get to, and then let's slow down a little bit. But let's just go through it real quick. When we looked at this, we talked about the different parts of the anatomy of the respiratory system. I'm going to go through that pretty quickly. Just got to learn that. Okay. But I think this is a cool picture. Let's look at this. So respiration, the whole concept here of breathing, remember, we talked about in class, already talked about, I think, in the video, why don't we breathe? Right? We've answered that. So we breathe so we can get oxygen into the bloodstream and get rid of CO2, which is our waste product for cellular respiration. So remember that equation for cellular respiration. But to do this, we're going to look at this. There's four things going to happen. We got to have pulmonary ventilation. We got to breathe the air down into the alveoli. Then we got to have a gas exchange here called pulmonary gas exchange, so that the oxygen leaves the air, goes into the blood. The CO2 leaves the blood and goes in the air. Then we got to transport this, and that's where I'm going to really pick up, because we're going to skip on over that in a minute, because I want you to know the percentages of how carbon dioxide and oxygen are carried. That's questions 7, 7, and 8 on your review sheet. And how does carbon dioxide cause a problem? And I misspelled that. Why is carbon dioxide a problem? That's okay, so it's okay. Anyway, and then we have to carry these gases in water that doesn't like gases. We already said that in the first video. And then we carry it to the body, to the body, with the big toe or wherever, and we got to do the tissue gas exchange, where we put the oxygen into the cells that need oxygen, and CO2 produced by cellular respiration then is put into the blood. Then we transport it back again to the lungs, and we do pulmonary ventilation there. That's pretty cool, right? And we talked about other functions of this, including speech, neurons of smell are in the nasals, right? And it actually helps us with childbirthing and urinating and defecating. We use the muscles of the breathing to do that, and kind of helps pull some of the blood back up to the heart too. Okay, we kind of went over the different parts here, kind of look at that. I'm going to skip over to the physiology part at the end there. Anatomy, I'm going to get to where we got to in our first PowerPoint. Looked at the vocal cords, sound, volume, all that's kind of cool. Okay, smoker, we talked about smoking causes problems. Didn't mean to blow that up, sorry. And here's our bronchioli tube. I love this next picture coming up. Here is a resin cast of a lung, and all the different little alveoli to the bronchioli is branched down to these millions of alveoli, right? And notice that when we get down to this, each terminal bronchioli branches into multiple respiratory bronchioli, and each of those is a cluster like of grapes with 20 or so alveoli, each with a capillary bed around it. So we're going to do that gas exchange right there at that capillary bed and the lining of the alveoli. Okay, so very cool stuff there. Okay, and then of course exchange occurs there. And here's the branching of the plumbing all the way down the alveoli sac. Here's an electron microscope showing the alveoli, right? The little sacs here. And this looks very weird because the slides look like this. So when you make a cut of this, it does not look like a cluster of grapes. It looks like a cluster of circles, okay, on a slide. Now, the alveoli wall itself has two main types of cells. This type 1 alveoli cell is the squamous cells that account for 90% of all the cells. And this is where we do the gas exchange between the capillary bed and the alveoli open air of it. So that's the main cell. This type 2, and I kind of skipped this and kind of quickly, but here we go. So here's a nice blow up. I have this in the lab book too. You can see here's the type 1 alveoli all the way around, and you have these couple of these type 2 right here, and they're going to produce this compound called surfactant. So the type 2 alveoli cells that make up 10% of the small cuboid cells lining the alveoli makes a chemical that reduces the surface tension of the alveoli and keeps them from collapsing. So water likes to grab each other behind your body. So if you get water as an emphysema or pneumonia or whatever, water down in there, then it will cause it to close off and it won't open back up. But another good analogy of this, if you ever seen a balloon and blew it up, it's got a little powder in it, and it easily blows up the first time. But if you get water in it, like a water balloon, and squirt water out and try to reblow it, it's harder to open it up because that plastic will stick together and hydrogen bonds, and the water will seal that off. So God made these alveoli type 2 cells to make the surfactant that reduces surface tension. We got a picture of that coming up in a little while. We'll see that again. Then we have alveolar macrophages, which are mobile phagocytic cells that eat the debris from the bone marrow, clean up and digest debris made that accumulates in the alveoli from the windpipe. Okay. Other one, here's another bad one. You've heard of tuberculosis. This is a bacterial infection that's very hard to stop, and it grows very slowly. And it forms tubers where just your body blocks off these sites of infection into little tubers in your lungs. And it's very easily diagnosed, or not diagnosed by an X-ray, but very hard to treat. Okay, it's hard to kill those. And we took for a long time to even grow those in the laboratory. So here's where our lungs are. There's a diaphragm. And our next concept is this concept of this pleural cavity, partial parietal pleural, remember the outer membrane of it, right? And then you have the visceral pleural, the membrane on the organ itself, and the serous fluid in between. So we get a rubbing of these lungs. We don't want to get a carpet burn on our lungs as they expand and recoil. So they're in this, they have that layer of serous fluid between the two membranes, the parietal pleural and the visceral pleural. Here's parts out again, maybe their function. I think it's pretty cool, but I'm going to bore you with all that. Okay. We're going to get into ventilation. So here's our big question here, number 3. How do we breathe? Okay, so breathing involves 2 steps. Inspiration, and that doesn't have a great idea of it. Means inhalation, bringing the air in, and then expiration is moving the air out. Okay, and the way we achieve this is by varying the pressure in these cavities. Okay, now air, if you remember, is a mix of gases. Okay, let's see if we can remember some of this real quick. I talked earlier. If you remember, air is about 80% nitrogen and around 20% oxygen. That's a little bit different. It's actually 79 and like 19 or 21, real close. But anyway, it's just close enough. And then there are other gases. Okay, so oxygen, no, and nitrogen. Okay, and let's just make it, like I said, 80% for just simple purposes. Okay, and then we have to consider partial pressure, and that is the pressure exerted by the air on us. And this is why I can't dunk. All this air is holding me down. And so if you got, here's the earth, and here's Robin standing on the earth. Okay, all this air is pushing down. And if you take a beaker of mercury and put a 1 millimeter glass column in it, now 1 millimeter, that's like a 1 foot there. The air pressure will push down on this and cause the mercury to rise up to 760 millimeters. And that is atmospheric pressure at sea level. That changes if you go higher. That's why it's harder to breathe when you go higher up. Okay. Going back to trying to move through the PowerPoint here. Here we go. I'll come back to this picture. So Boyle's law describes the relationship between pressure and volume. It states that at constant temperature and number of gas molecules, pressure and volume of gases are inversely related to each other. In other words, as you increase the volume, pressure falls, and as you decrease volume, pressure goes up. So we're going to achieve this. Actually, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to flip it around. Take that, flip it around, and I always wish they would flip it for us here. But if you look at this, to breathe in is very much like a syringe, except this way. There's the lungs, and then here's the thoracic cavity. Now watch. As we take the plunger in a syringe and pull down, then we decrease the pressure in here, and then the drugs we're pulling from then come down from high to low and fill up this plunger. So we do the same thing. Our chest cavity is going to come up and out, and then we pull the diaphragm down, and that creates negative pressure in here. And that 760 atmosphere now in here is 758, and the air rushes into the lungs and expands and fills the lungs up. That's how we breathe. And we'll see that. She's going to talk about that there in that PowerPoint, and we're going to go here. We're going to get the picture. I like pictures. So as we breathe in, we lower the atmospheric pressure, and the air then rushes in and fills the lungs that you see here. And then expiration is the recoil of the balloon-like nature of the alveoli themselves. And the chest cavity comes back down and diaphragm backs up, and we get positive pressure and we blow the air out. Okay, so that is so the exhalation is often said to be free, doesn't require lots of energy, right? But inhalation does. And if you get cut in a drug deal and have a collapsed lung, then the pressure equalizes itself to that hole, so you can't breathe in. You have to do artificial respiration then. Okay, so that's how pretty much the mechanism of inspiration. Diaphragm down, chest cavity up and out. Right, and we lower that pressure in there. Okay, here are the muscles involved in breathing. A sigh, let's get to the table. We have a table of these. A sigh is a slight and slow and deep inspiration that is held and followed by a slow expiration. Okay, a yawn is an extra deep breath that stops to maybe clear out some of the old air out of the respiratory system. Opens, collapse alveoli. Yawning when tired occurs to minimize alveoli collapse during sleep. Yawning after sleep opens alveoli that have collapsed during sleep. Sneezing is a forced expiration out the upper respiratory, and that is going to clear the upper respiratory, clears the foreign debris of the nasal cavity. And a cough, similar to a sneeze, except the initial inspiration is a small or is absent. The velocity can reach 500 miles an hour, and it blows out clears out the larynx and lower larynx, trachea, and lower airways. Okay, that's pretty cool. Also seen some weird stuff that yawns can also appear to be psycho-induced. In other words, if I yawn in front of the class, about 4 or 5 people yawn, and the people in psychology say that is because those of you who yawn are very selfish people deep down, and you're just getting your share of the oxygen for robbing and sucks it all up. I don't necessarily agree with that theory, but that's one that I've read and hadn't seen in books. Okay, and that shows it again. Same thing here. The airways, it can constrict and so forth. And here's where we get back to that surfactant. So water molecules like to grab each other. And so when we have a collapsed lung, water will grab itself and that will keep it closed. Surfactants lower surface tension on water so that the alveoli don't collapse and grab each other. The water don't grab, bodies don't grab each other and hold it together so we can open back up when we inhale. Okay. Pulmonary compliance, last physical factor influences effectiveness of gas exchange, ability of the lungs and chest wall to stretch. So that's another one. These tissues have to remain like elastic, and we have to have that. Have to have the surface tension lowered here so that we can breathe. Surfactants are not produced until the last 10 to 12 weeks of gestation. So we have made artificial surfactant that we can spray into children's lungs so that they can be taken early from mother. And that would be like what, last 3 months, 2.5 to 3 months. So these premature babies taken before that have to have that put in. Also, CPAP's pretty common, right? Delivery of surfactant by inhalation. Also, positive air pressure flow. CPAPs can help push the air into the alveoli, and that's a lot of people do that for sleep apnea. Okay. Then we looked at different volumes here, and I think we'll look at just a couple of them off the table. But I think we're going to skip this lab in our virtual year. But we have spirometers, these instruments we breathe into, and we can measure all these respirations. The main ones to look at is total volume is around 6 liters in your lungs. So you have a 6-liter aquarium of air in your lungs. And each time you breathe in and out, this tidal volume is around 500 milliliters. That's pretty cool. So on average, you breathe in about 500 milliliters in and out every time. So think of it, that's what, about 12% of the total volume. So every time you're like dipping 12% of the air out and putting fresh air in every time, keeping that mixed. And the one that we actually measure in lab is this vital capacity, which is actually the maximum amount of air you can forcibly breathe out of your lungs in one forceful exhalation without, one more time, the maximum of air you can blow out in one deep breath. Okay. And that's the one that we can, and it actually lowers as you get older, okay, and shorter and more female. So the bigger you are, the taller you are, the younger you are, the more vital capacity you have. We have tables in our lab book, we can measure that, and that's a fun lab to do. We've basically done that one. There's the actual volume expected for an average person, but that vital capacity does change as you get older, it gets lower, and if you're shorter, it's lower, and if you're more female, it's lower. Okay, and so this is one that we can look at, and we do an experiment in lab where we measure your expected vital capacity. That's pretty cool. Okay, and then we got the gas exchange. I want you to know these numbers. We're going to look at both of them, the pulmonary gas exchange and the tissue gas exchange. And this is getting into that partial pressure I was telling you about. So Dalton's law says that each gas in a mixture of gas like air has its own partial pressure. So atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. You should have 78% of the air is nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and what is that? 1% all these other mixed up other extra gases. Okay, I got argon here for one of them. Okay, so in this case, multiply that percentage by the atmospheric pressure, and so the partial pressure for nitrogen in our air is 593. partial pressure for oxygen is 160, and for carbon dioxide is way lower, so it's less than 1, or less than 7, right? Because this argon there is actually the gas that's more common than carbon dioxide. Okay, so when we get to that alveoli, we're going to see the mixture of these, right? Look, carbon dioxide is the lowest partial pressure of gases. Air is less than 1%, but it does have a 20 times greater affinity for going in solution in water than oxygen. So getting to this picture here, here is the actual gas exchange at the alveoli. And I would like you to put this on a test question. This is number describe the pulmonary gas exchange number 5, and then in the second we'll do 6. So at the alveoli, the oxygen leaves the air and goes in the blood because the partial pressure is 104 in our atmosphere is 108 or 160, but by the time we get to alveoli, it's 104. And then the carbon dioxide in the blood, excuse me, the oxygen levels in the blood is 40, so the oxygen goes into the blood. CO2 is 40 in the alveoli, which is way higher than the air, but in the blood coming from the body is 45. So CO2 then leaves and goes into, got it. See who's calling here. No problem, it's like spam. All right, moving on. Then we can go to carry it, right? Then we can go to the alveoli, looking for the other one here. Did I skip it? And at the alveoli, excuse me, at the body tissue, now we're doing the gas exchange out in the tissues. By the time it reaches down to your big toe, the oxygen partial pressure 100, and the cells is 40, so oxygen leaves the blood, it goes in the cell, and the CO2 now is over 45 out at the cellular level, and so CO2 leaves and goes into the directly there into the back to the blood to be carried back to the lungs to be carried out of the body. Now the next question then is how we're going to do this, right? How do we carry this? And so probably one of my favorite parts of this chapter is explaining how this gas transportation occurs. And we already know that oxygen is carried by hemoglobin, right? So 98% of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, right? And hemoglobin is a cool compound in the red blood cell that will give up oxygen wherever partial pressure is lowest. Thereby, the red blood cells gives oxygen to the muscles and other parts of the body where we need lots of oxygen, where you're making lots of ATP, because it's used directly to make ATP. And these graphs just show that it gives it up where the temperature is highest, where the partial pressure is lowest, et cetera, as you would expect it to do. Okay, that's what these graphs are showing. It gives it up wherever the pH is lowest. That means activity is occurring there. Okay, and you can watch that video sometime on your own. You don't waste your time with it, but it shows you how cool that is. And then carbon dioxide is carried with a couple of other ways. If I got this pen working here, yeah. So carbon dioxide, 7% is a dissolved gas. 7 to 10%. We'll just round it up to 10. And then 20% is bound to the hemoglobin, and it's called carbaminohemoglobin. Carbon dioxide is being carried by the hemoglobin. But 70% is going to be carried as bicarbonate ions, which is HCO3. And actually on the next picture, you can see that equation, I believe. So this is the equation. So at the alveoli, out in the body, where we're making carbon dioxide coming in the blood at the tissue exchange, the carbon dioxide binds with water and forms carbonic acid, H2CO3. That breaks it apart into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Now, don't forget that the pH is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. Remember, the pH scale goes from 1 to 14, with 14 being very basic, very little hydrogen, and pH 1 is pure hydrochloric acid, or extreme highest level of hydrogen we've ever measured. So this bicarbonate then is an ion or a molecule that can go in solution. And so we carry this gas as a solid of sort that goes in solution. And then when we get back to the alveoli, we do the reverse. We have enzymes that speed this up, carbonic anhydrase is in the red blood cells to help do this. And we'll look at this graph. It actually occurs in the red blood cell. Look at that. So it comes in, the CO2 comes in, it's converted into the bicarbonate, and then once we get back, that's actually bringing it back. Here it is. There's at the tissue level. The hydrogen is carried out, and bicarbonate goes in solution, and then when we get back to the alveoli, we do the reverse. Pretty fascinating. So that's it. So we take a solid, we take a gas that water don't like gas. We've already saw that in the first lecture. Convert it into a solid or into an ion molecule that can then go in solution, and then we do the reverse at the alveoli to get that CO2 out. And the other point with sedimented is that bicarbonate then is the main buffer in our blood, that HCO3, because it can grab a hydrogen and become carbonic acid, or it can release a hydrogen and become H and CO3. Very fascinating. Matter of fact, that carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is the primary buffer to keep our blood pH between 7.35 and 7.45. If it gets below that, we die of acidosis. If it gets above that, we die of extremely high, too high pH. Alkalosis, okay? So anyway, pretty cool. So when we increase breathing, we're going to do what? Get rid of carbon dioxide, and we're going to suck up hydrogen. We're going to lower the pH, right? Is that correct? Think about that. So when pH decreases, hydrogen bonds, the buffers like bicarbonate make carbonic acid, right? And when pH is increasing, then it can do the reverse. Okay, so if we go back to the equation and think about that, if we increase this right here and we get rid of carbon dioxide, we push the equation this way, we suck up hydrogen ions, and that's going to raise the pH. That's fine, this lecture kicking in. If we stop this, hydrogen ions will build up, and that will then lower the pH. So they're inverse of each other. Okay, pretty cool. Okay, just talking about pH scale here. We already done that, talked about that. Carbon dioxide transport, we mentioned that. Here's a couple of cool ones. Hyperventilation. Rate and depth of breathing increase the amount of CO2 expired from the lungs. They'll have less carbonic acid formed, less hydrogens are formed, and pH then will rise to get rid of hydrogens. Hypoventilation, when you're choking somebody, right? Reduce carbon dioxide in the blood, more carbonic acid is formed, leading to more hydrogens formed in the blood, and you become acid. pH goes down. Respiratory alkalosis can occur if hyperventilation continues, right? You get an increase of relative lack of carbon results in increase in blood pH. And then respiratory acidosis occurs if hypoventilation and increased CO2 levels in the blood causes blood pH to decrease. Those are pretty cool. There they are. Wrote those out for you. See them in the picture there, how they occur, right? Very cool. Carbon dioxide, which is found when we smoke cigarettes, small engines, heaters. This odorless, colorless, tasteless gas that has a 230 to 300, 200 to 230 times higher affinity for hemoglobin. So if you get around a propane burner that's not properly ventilated, and you breathe in carbon dioxide, or car exhaust, people pull in their driveway, cut the windows down, listen to music, with the car running, and then people have died from this. It binds to it, and you can't get the carbon dioxide off, so you can't carry oxygen. And the only way to get that carbon dioxide off is to put them in a hyperbaric chamber pressure cooker to force that off. Pretty wild. Confusion, dizziness, nausea, and then eventually coma. Treatment is 100% oxygen in atmosphere or hyperbaric chamber. Okay, pretty cool. And so we got the summary there showing how we do it all again. Okay, let's see. We can watch it. See what this got. That was maybe a good video here. Cut the pen off.
Ventilation, or breathing, is the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. It allows oxygen to reach the exchange surfaces of the alveoli and carbon dioxide to be removed from the body. Ventilation consists of inspiration, which brings air into the lungs, and expiration, which moves air out of the lungs. It is driven by pressure and volume changes. One of the simplest ways to change the pressure inside a container is to change its volume. The relationship is known as Boyle's law, which states that as the volume of the container increases, the pressure of the gas inside decreases. Conversely, as the volume decreases, the pressure of the gas increases. If we think of the lungs as a container of air, then changing the volume of the lungs will affect the air pressure inside. The volume of the lungs can be adjusted by varying the size of the thoracic cavity using muscles such as the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles. In order to understand pulmonary ventilation, we need to consider three important pressures. The first is atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure of air molecules due to the weight of the atmosphere. Atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury at sea level and decreases as we move above sea level. The second important pressure, intrapulmonary pressure, is the pressure inside lung alveoli. Finally, the third pressure we will consider is intrapleural pressure, or the pressure inside the pleural cavity. Recall that the pleural cavity is between the visceral and parietal pleurae. The visceral pleura covers the lungs, and the parietal pleura lines the inside of the thoracic cavity. Now let's see how pulmonary ventilation occurs. When the lungs are at rest, the atmospheric pressure, or the pressure outside, is equal to the intrapulmonary pressure, or the pressure inside the lungs. Since no pressure gradient exists, there is no airflow. Interestingly, the intrapleural pressure does not equal atmospheric pressure and is approximately 4 millimeters of mercury lower at 756. This is due to a slight vacuum present in the pleural cavity. During inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, and the external intercostal muscles contract and pull the chest wall up and out. As a result, the volume of the lungs increases and the intrapulmonary pressure decreases. When the pressure inside the lungs becomes lower than atmospheric pressure, a gradient is generated and air flows from the area of higher pressure to the area of lower pressure. In other words, air flows into the lungs. At the same time, the intrapleural pressure decreases to about 754 millimeters of mercury. It is now below the intrapulmonary pressure and therefore allows the lungs to expand. Expiration works in the opposite manner. The diaphragm relaxes and returns to its dome-shaped position. This, along with relaxation of the intercostal muscles, decreases the size of the thoracic cavity, therefore increasing intrapulmonary pressure. When the pressure inside the lungs increases above atmospheric pressure, air again flows down the resulting pressure gradient toward the region of lower pressure, which in this case is outside of the lungs. Intrapleural pressure increases briefly during expiration, then returns to its resting state. Keep in mind that it always remains lower than atmospheric pressure and intrapulmonary pressure. If inspiration and expiration are deeper forced instead of quiet, additional muscles, such as the internal intercostals and abdominal muscles, can contract to allow larger changes in lung volumes and pressures, but the principles of ventilation remain the same.
Pretty cool. So that's just showing us that. I thought this is pretty cool too. Kind of a quick overview of our gas exchanges. Let's watch this too. Kind of a good summary.
So far, we have learned how gases move into and out of the lungs via pulmonary ventilation, and how they are exchanged between the alveoli and the blood via pulmonary gas exchange. In the next step of respiration, oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported between the lungs and the tissues by traveling in the blood. Let's begin by taking a look at how oxygen is transported. Oxygen's solubility in water is rather low, so it cannot easily dissolve in plasma. As a result, only about 1.5% of the oxygen picked up by the blood in the lungs is dissolved in plasma. The remaining 98.5% enters erythrocytes and is transported in blood bound to the protein hemoglobin. There are about 280 million hemoglobin molecules inside each erythrocyte. Each hemoglobin consists of 4 polypeptides. Each polypeptide contains a heme group with an iron in the center, which is capable of binding to 1 oxygen molecule. Thus, each hemoglobin can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. The binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is a reversible reaction. This is important because oxygen needs first to be loaded onto hemoglobin in the lungs and then unloaded in the tissues. In the lungs, oxygen from the alveoli binds to hemoglobin inside erythrocytes and the pulmonary capillaries. Hemoglobin bound to oxygen is called oxyhemoglobin. Such hemoglobin can be partially saturated, carrying fewer than 4 oxygen molecules, or fully saturated, carrying a full load of 4 oxygen molecules. At a partial pressure of oxygen of about 100 millimeters of mercury, which is what we find in the lungs, all hemoglobin molecules are fully, or 100%, saturated. This can be seen on a hemoglobin saturation curve. During unloading in the tissues, hemoglobin releases oxygen to the tissue cells. The amount of oxygen unloaded must strictly match the metabolic needs of the tissues. As you can see on this hemoglobin saturation curve, once the partial pressure of oxygen drops below 100 millimeters of mercury, hemoglobin unloads some of its oxygen cargo. At a tissue oxygen partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury, hemoglobin saturation is 75%, which means that 75% of the hemoglobin's heme groups are bound to oxygen, and 25% of the heme groups have released their oxygens to the tissues. Metabolically active tissues use more oxygen. Therefore, tissue oxygen partial pressures might drop below 40. As a result, more oxygen will be unloaded from hemoglobin to these tissues. Now let's look at the transport of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is picked up from body tissues and is transported to the lungs. It travels in the blood differently than does oxygen. There are 3 distinct transport mechanisms for carbon dioxide. First, between 7 and 10% of all carbon dioxide is transported by being dissolved directly in plasma. This is possible because carbon dioxide is much more soluble in liquids than is oxygen. Second, about 20% of carbon dioxide enters erythrocytes and binds to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide reversibly binds to the protein portion of hemoglobin and not the heme group where oxygen binds. Finally, about 70% of all carbon dioxide is converted to the more soluble bicarbonate ion inside of erythrocytes. Erythrocytes contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which catalyzes the conversion of carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is fairly unstable and quickly dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. Hydrogen ions bind to hemoglobin, which acts as a buffer and helps to minimize pH fluctuations. Bicarbonate ions leave erythrocytes and exchange for chloride ions, a phenomenon called the chloride shift. In the lungs, the diffusion of carbon dioxide out of erythrocytes causes carbonic anhydrase to operate in reverse. The reverse reaction produces carbon dioxide and water from carbonic acid. This reaction consumes bicarbonate ions, which now enter the cell through a reverse of the chloride shift, and hydrogen ions, which are released by hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide also dissociates from hemoglobin, and the carbon dioxide molecules from erythrocytes, in addition to those dissolved in plasma, diffuse out of the blood in the pulmonary capillaries and into the alveoli to be exhaled.
Okay, pretty good stuff there. I thought that was pretty cool to show you the videos. Breathing control. Breathing usually occurs without conscious thought or control, right? Some diseases can throw that off. Much there. Brain stems controlling this. Actually, get down. You can see here that we have these two both the pons and the medulla oblongata, the ventral respiratory group and respiratory pattern generator. Okay, all of these both control the rate and depth of breathing. Okay, pretty cool. Chemoreceptors in the body also can watch for concentrations of CO2 and hydrogen ions and can adjust breathing accordingly. Okay, also we can, there we go, showing that. So high CO2 levels or hydrogen penetration trigger hyperventilation, low carbon dioxide levels or hydrogen would trigger hypoventilation, right? And that's showing how those would work. Pretty cool. Peripheral chemoreceptors can detect oxygen in the carotid arteries and the aortic bodies. And they can also then tell the brain when there's stretch receptors in the lung also can let us know if we overbreathe. There we go, a little bit better showing how that occurs. Very cool. High altitude acclimation, gradual increase in elevation over a period of days rather than hours, allows climbers to tolerate more lower atmospheric oxygen levels. Peripheral chemoreceptors stimulate increase in ventilation, permitting body to maintain acceptable CO2 levels. You can actually take a pill that will help with the enzyme there so that you will be able to do that better. It can require days, requires days because sensitivity of chemoreceptors for low PO2 increases with prolonged exposure. The longer they're exposed to low PO2, the more they stimulate an increase in ventilation. That's why it allows experienced climbers to reach greater elevation without supplementing oxygen if they go to a high level base camp, or for example, if you go hiking, you come in Rocky Mountain National Park, go to Denver for a few days before because you're already a mile high, and that gets you accommodated before you go to Rocky Mountain National Park. Disease of the respiratory system, right? Mainly looking at things that restrict lung, that's going to restrict getting the oxygen into the bloodstream. Here's a couple bad ones: pulmonary fibrosis, chronic inflammation of the lung tissue with vesicular destruction, elastic tissue, pneumonia, and like pneumococcal about that. That's the one that's where you have the asbestos and heavy metal poisoning, and that breaks down the connective tissue, can cause cancer. Deformity of the chest wall or neuromuscular diseases can cause problems. Again, the more common here, obstructive lung diseases, things that clog up the airflow. These include COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, airway defined as persistent airway obstruction that is not fully reversible. Three subtypes of that can be caused by emphysema, small air disease, and chronic bronchitis. Emphysema obstruct the respiratory alveoli burst, so you have a smaller area to do exchange, and bronchitis is always associated with cigarette smoke, and all these irritants increase mucus cell production and cause the paralysis of the cilia, and they can't clean out the dirt. So bronchitis, you're going to get that if you smoke. You're going to get smoker's cough, and that leads to emphysema. Asthma, obstructive disease in which airways are hyper responsive to a variety of stimulus, including the dust mites, mold, pollen, animal dandruff, and your bronchioli, smooth muscle constrict down, closing down the airways. Okay, and of course we can treat that with what? An inhaler of epinephrine to open up and cause smooth muscle to relax. And of course, lung cancer, one of the worst diagnoses you get is stage 2 or 3 lung cancer, right? Very low survival rate. Smoking raises the risk of lung cancer 13 times. Heavy smokers, if you smoke a pack a day, increases your odds of getting lung cancer 60, 70 times normal. And the data is suggesting that if you hang around a smoker, you might as well light them up, because secondhand smoke seems to be as deadly as someone smoking a cigarette if you're riding in a car with somebody. Here is lung cancer, obstructive lung disease here, cancer in the interior there. And that is the end of that chapter, guys. And I hope that helps. I'm going to get that posted today for y'all. And y'all have a good day.